Thank you everyone for coming along to this Fringe event organised by Policy Exchange, kindly sponsored by Diageo. The title today is A Labour Trade Policy for Government, and I'm joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers. Each of them are going to speak for sort of 3 or 4 minutes first, and then we will try and have a Q&A with the audience. I might throw in some questions too, so please do think of questions as we get going, and put your hand up later on, and I will try to come to as many of you as I can. First of all, we are going to hear from the Right Honourable Nick Thomas-Symonds, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. Then to his left, we're going to hear from Aileen Keyes, International Head of International Public Policy at Diageo. And then we are going to hear from Shevaun Haviland, Director General of the British Chambers, and then Sally Jones, Trade Partner at EY, and Sam Lowe of Flint Global. So without further ado, let me hand over to Nick. And just to say, actually, if you could speak straight into the microphones, because they're not very sensitive, apparently.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you to Policy Exchange, indeed to Diageo. And it's lovely to see so many people here and to get a full room for this event. And thank you, obviously, to people who are joining us online for this as well. And I've been coming to Labour Party conferences for well over 25 years, and I can really remember a conference, certainly more recently, with the energy that this one has got. And I think we really have moved from that terrible defeat of 2019 to be contenders for government, really are here as a government in waiting. And the debates that we are having, whether about trade or other matters, are so, so important. Now, I'm absolutely clear that without a solid trade platform, we can't achieve the aims that we have of delivering prosperity and good quality jobs. And I don't see trade in isolation. I see it as linked to the work that Rachel Reeves is doing on our climate investment pledge of £28 billion each and every year. It's linked to the industrial strategy that Johnny Reynolds published yesterday. And all of that is about building a strong, secure economy that can then fund the strong public services that we want to see. Not what appears to be trustonomics, which is making good on her promise that on becoming Prime Minister she would, quote, hit the ground. Now, I am explicit that Labour is a pro-trade party, and I really do believe our country has the talents to thrive in this period of great global challenges and change. We are world leaders in so many sectors, from science to law, financial services, creative industries, engineering, and much, much more beside. But when I'm speaking to businesses, what businesses are saying to me is they need a partnership from government to be able to develop and to grow. And it's very much that partnership approach of being pro-worker, pro-business, pro-trade that I will be all about as the Trade Secretary. Now, I've recently published a biography of Harold Wilson, who, point of fact, was actually the British negotiator when the original GATT was formed in the late 1940s, the forerunner of the WTO. So that chapter turned out to be of particular interest to me, not that I realised when I started the book. And he talked about the new Britain forged in the white heat of a scientific revolution. Now, I'll resist the temptation to talk of a green heat, but you know what I mean. It really is about embracing the future. And the trade deals that I will want to conduct around the world, the trade deals that I will want to negotiate, they will not be trade deals that will be engaged in a race to the bottom. They are trade deals that, of course, trade itself will be central to them, but I will be looking to promote high standards, not low standards, the environmental protections we want to see, the workers' rights that we want to see, and in other cases too, of course, human rights as well. But I think the next Labour government will have to re-establish the UK's international reputation on the world stage. It used to be said that being the British Prime Minister in diplomacy was something of a balancing act, particularly between France on the one side and the United States on the other, and ensuring the special relationship and being a bridge. And the problem was, if you leaned too much towards the one, you had problems with the other. So Liz Truss, I suppose, with France and the US, deserves special recognition, having managed to follow up with both of them in her first 2 weeks in the job. It takes some doing on your first phone call with the US president to have him not only rule out a trade deal, but it be reported we no longer use the phrase special relationship. And this was after her confusion as to whether President Macron was a friend or a foe. Astonishing. Maybe that is the way to get through a Tory leadership hustings, which certainly isn't the way to be a Prime Minister on the international stage. Now, I also want to talk as well about our trading relationship with the European Union. And Keir Starmer set out in a speech at the Irish Embassy earlier this year what our approach will be. We will take a constructive, pragmatic approach. The megaphone diplomacy of this current government is not working. Clearly, we will have a number of priorities. We need to sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the way you sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol is the approach that Labour in government has taken time and again when dealing with Northern Ireland, whether it was with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the St Andrews Agreement later on in 2006-07. It's about getting people round a table, doing the unglamorous work, moving inch by inch in a negotiation to find a solution. And that is what we would be doing on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We would want to tear down the unnecessary trade barriers as much as we can within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and provide support to our world-leading services and indeed our scientists in the way that they can collaborate within the EU. More widely, beyond trade, the security relationship with the EU would be very, very important. Now, these are some of the things that we would want to do. We'd want to negotiate, for example, a veterinary agreement with the EU. These are things that will be the nuts and bolts of what we do. But the reality is it's about political will and approach. And our approach will be to put trade first, to have a constructive, pragmatic relationship that allows our businesses to thrive, both trading with the EU and with the approach we will take to securing trade deals and trade opportunities around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Aileen, would you like to?
Yes, and thanks very much for allowing us to sponsor this event. We're delighted to be here. And,
You might have to just lean into the microphone a bit. Sorry. Thank you.
Oh, is that better? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I want to tell you a little bit about Diageo, actually, because I think, you know, people probably don't know the names so well, but you'll probably know many of our brands. We have about 200 brands sold in 180 countries around the world, brands like Tanqueray, Gordon's, Johnny Walker, Guinness. I hope many of you have enjoyed them at conference today or in the future. And it's a really, you know, what we do is the majority of our production, the products that we make in the UK is exported around the world. So about 85% of what we make in the UK goes around the world. And to give you a flavour of what that means, you know, 14 bottles of Johnny Walker are sold every second. 2 bottles of gins are sold every second, and 2/3 of that is the UK's total spirits export, so a huge contribution. I think people often think about Scotch and gin as things that we enjoy in the UK, but actually the majority of what we do is produced around the world. Now, why is that important? Scotland is a hugely important part of our business. It's where our largest global spirits supply centre is located. And we produce around 50 million cases of leading brands from Scotland, Scotch whisky and gin and vodka, and that goes around the world. We employ about 11,000 people in Scotland, and many of them are in economically disadvantaged areas, so really important that we're, you know, looking outwards but bringing that investment back to the UK as well. And not just the jobs that we directly support, but also throughout our supply chain. If we think of our farmers, we think of the people that make the bottles, of our distribution network, so huge, the number of jobs supported across the picture. But we're also part of, you know, a bigger industry. So if I think about spirits, it's one of the UK's huge success stories and a great export success story. We contribute about 5 billion of exports, employ about 50,000 people across the UK. And Scotch represents a quarter of the UK food and drinks export. It's the single biggest contributor to the UK's balance of trade and goods. So why did I tell you all that? I want to tell you that because of the size and the scale of our exports and the jobs that delivers back in the UK. And that's, you know, about getting the UK economic policy right, but also about getting international trade policy right as well. So we see huge opportunities in the free trade agreements that are negotiated, and it was good to hear you talk about new deals as well. One of the huge markets for us is actually India, so it's the second largest market by volume for Scotch. Within that, Scotch only accounts for about 2% of that total volume, so there's huge opportunity for growth. But the single biggest barrier that we see in India is actually the 150% import duty. It's the second biggest import duty in the world. So a huge opportunity to grow Scotch, to grow jobs, not just for big companies like Diageo who are already invested in India, but actually for those smaller producers and for the people in the supply chain as well to benefit from that. And tariffs are the #1 barrier to trade that we see in our sector. I think a really recent example is what we saw with Scotch getting wrapped into the Boeing Airbus dispute and the retaliatory tariffs that we saw there. Now, we were delighted to see that resolved, but actually it's taken a while for Scotch exports to return to the level that they were. So these, instant reactions can create longer term impacts as well. So trying to get that balance of having trade done fairly, not into this kind of tit for tat retaliatory tariffs is really important. But it's why we're excited about the India FTA, because there is a big opportunity to reduce tariffs and to kind of continue that international diplomacy through it as well. We believe that removing the import tariff on Scotch on India will increase revenue for the Exchequer by about 1.1 billion over the next 3 to 5 years. But also for India, it'll increase their state tax revenues about 3.5 billion. So a win for India and a win for the UK, and something we're really committed to. But we also, and you touched on it, Nick, about growing trade in the right way. We're a responsible, sustainable business, and we've got a really clear 2030 strategy that's about reducing our carbon efficiency, or reducing our carbon use, about reducing the amount of water that we use in our drinks by 1/3, and also building and supporting local communities. I think there's so much to do. If I think about what we do in India around about water security, ensuring community health, and a big focus on empowering women and girls. About half of the work that we do in India is entirely focused on empowering young women and girls in that community. Our water programmes have reached more than 75 villages, and they've benefited about 123,000 people, and as I say, about half of that has gone towards women. But as I sit here talking to you at Labour conference, I think, and Nick, you mentioned it as well, about trade being a vehicle to boost international cooperation, understanding and supporting responsible and sustainable growth. As I look around the room, I think about, those principles of internationalism that are so core to a Labour Party, and thinking about the global structures that are so important to that as well. So if we think about the World Trade Organization, that helps provide stability and opportunity to help businesses like ours, but also to help others prosper and grow from that as well. So a really important pillar. It not only benefits our shareholders, of course, but to the communities and people whose livelihoods are supported by our investment and growth. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion later. And again, thanks for the opportunity to have me here. I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Aileen. Shevaun, please.
Thank you. Does that work? I think that works. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So, British Chambers of Commerce, we represent the 53 chambers of the UK, covering every region and nation, and the 79 chambers, British chambers all around the world. So, truly a global organisation. Trade is absolutely at the heart of what the chambers do. Businesses that trade, as you know, they grow faster, they're more innovative, they pay better, they're generally more resilient. And by the way, Chancellor, businesses that trade are bringing money back into the coffers of the UK, so it's crucially important. About 10% of businesses in the UK export, and that includes goods and services. About 60% of chamber members export. And that is a great stat that I like to use a lot. And that is because the Chamber Network are great at giving trade advice, which is really crucial, the documentation, the customs, and of course, 79 chambers all around the world to give you that partner or distributor into those markets. And that's the #1 thing that businesses are looking for when they want to start exporting. Government have set a export strategy. It's a very big number, but actually, how are we helping the SMEs of our nation get there? We really want to push the idea of building a sort of national trade accelerator. How can we help businesses that may be exporting to 1 or 2 places, so sort of get how to do it? Why aren't they exporting to 10 or 12 places? And that's what we need collectively, but also the government to help make happen. We published earlier this year our trade manifesto. We want to be a loud, proud voice for trade, which of course has taken a bit of a battering over the last few years. And that's not just the issues we need to address in the TCA, which I think we're all very familiar with, but it is incredibly frustrating that we haven't moved that on more quickly. But also, great to see the new FTAs, absolutely, working closely with government on that. But again, it is government that build FTAs, but it is business that use them. So how are we showing businesses that, in fact, if you were exporting here, if you export over here, you're going to save yourself another X £1,000s on preferential tariffs. And in fact, we just, through our Chamber Customs business, just did a piece of work helping a business look at their compliance of their trade documentation, and actually found we saved them £250,000 overnight because we're paying preferences that they didn't need to, paying tariffs that they didn't need to. And then I think I'll say just a quick last word on, the thing that Nick and I were talking about at breakfast this morning about, and you touched on the WTO, but as the international part of the international Chambers of Commerce and the World Chambers Federation, I was with the World Chambers a few months ago, 150 chambers from around the world. And, we, despite geopolitical issues, of which we are obviously facing many, trade, business, commerce can really be those channels that keep going through all of that and keep those conversations open and keep those pathways working. And that's really, really important for a global peace and prosperity. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shevaun. Sally.
Hello. It's lovely to be here. I'm stunned that it's a standing room only event on trade, but couldn't be happier. Normally it's just my mother and my dog, so this is lovely. I thought I might take a slightly different tack, and although I know we're here to talk about policy, I thought maybe I wouldn't. Because a policy is only as good as it's implemented, and so I wanted to just talk very briefly about some practical issues with policy that stop it being used and therefore stop it being effective. So I want to talk about implementation, I want to talk about data, and I want to talk about women. So I was beyond thrilled to hear Nick say, and I'm quoting you directly, unglamorous work moving inch by inch is important, because that's what so much of implementing a trade deal is actually about. It's not sexy, it's not a photo opportunity, it's not a signing ceremony. But without that implementation, nothing actually changes. And so one of my strongest encouragements to Nick when he's Secretary of State for International Trade is to do that unsexy, unglamorous stuff that actually makes the day-to-day difference. If I were to pick 3 things that could be changed straight away, I would be looking at export promotion and suggesting that the government stops trying to spread money everywhere, but instead focuses on some really big bets on Britain's key industries. And I would put green tech and green services right at the heart of that. My second would be to actually look again at what the overseas posts are doing, because all of my clients tell me they get a much lesser sense of being looked after from the British overseas posts than they do from the equivalent posts from other countries, and therefore they don't feel loved and they don't want to invest in the UK. And I would look again at the gov.uk website, which is hopeless. And if we just brought all of the trade information into one place, it would make a step change difference in how easy it is for businesses to export. So those are just 3 really practical implementation points that we could take a look at. So then data. Now, since we stopped doing Eurostat reporting, Britain's trade data doesn't make sense anymore. And it might be that that's because of the impact of the TCA, and that will be part of it. But I am deeply suspicious that the trade data that we're seeing coming out is accurate anymore. And if we are going to be making policy decisions, we have to be basing it on good information. We need to be looking around the world at what other people do to collect trade data and making sure we're picking up the best practice from around the world and doing that, rather than just same old, and hoping that we get good information out, because I'm deeply sceptical that we are. third and final thing I promised that I wanted to talk about was women. And again, I was absolutely delighted to hear about the work Diageo is doing in India on women and girls, because it is one of the least tapped sources of productivity and growth, is helping women around the world to trade. And I would love the UK to have even stronger gender chapters in all of the free trade agreements. Because if we can help women move out of the informal into the formal economy, then they'll get better protections. That's true in the UK, but it's even more true overseas. If we can help women move into properly remunerated trade, it'll benefit everyone across the piece. And if we can help SMEs who are overly dominated by women within that group, so strong SME chapters in our free trade agreements as well, it'll move the dial not just in the UK, but in developing countries everywhere, and we can do a really good, forceful thing there. So that's my ask of the Labour administration.
Thank you very much, Sally. And finally, Sam.
Going to hunch forward to make sure I'm in the microwave. Thank you very much for having me. I must say to begin, because everyone's quoting Nick back at him, I was sort of encouraged to hear you describe Labour as a pro-trade party. But the reason I say that is actually discussing trade in a Labour context, I find, as someone who sort of talks to everyone, and I'll be talking to Conservatives next week as well, is actually much more difficult than, say, talking to Conservatives or people on sort of right of centre. And that's because I feel that Labour is much more acutely aware of the trade-offs inherent to any trade policy. It's sort of quite easy to say trade is great, but you do then have to address distributional impacts, the fact that sometimes the benefits are quite widely spread and there are some acute difficulties in certain areas. But I do think it is important that Labour does wrestle with those trade-offs. Because when we think of the world as it exists right now, which is incredibly turbulent, if you think we've had, in sort of recent memory, we've had sort of war in Europe, we've had a pandemic, we're expecting increased climate change, sort of created disruption, and we've also, on top of that, the UK has left the European Union, and sort of erected trade barriers with its largest trading partner. And within all of this, there is a need for the UK to be resilient. And there are some things any government could do quite quickly that would help there, stabilising the relationship with Europe. I'm not necessarily even talking about deepening it at this point, but just putting it on a steady footing would help. But also we need to accept that for a country such as the UK, with the demands of the population, the sort of lifestyle aspirations people have, the UK isn't like the US, where it can essentially go close to full autarky without suffering too much damage to consumer welfare. We're not self-sufficient, but we need to be resilient. And I do feel that there is sometimes a problem whereby people conflate those things. I was talking at the NFU conference earlier this year, and farmer after farmer standing up saying, well, we need to grow more at home, we need to be resilient, we need to be self-sufficient. And it's true that part of self-sufficiency is producing at home. It's having industry. It's having the ability to source things locally. But you also have to be able to source from elsewhere, because if, to put it sort of simplistically, if your factory burns down and you've only got one of them, it doesn't really matter if it's the UK or somewhere else. And in order to get to this step, this sort of resilient state, it requires having the discussion about imports as well, because actually resilience requires being able to source what you need from wherever in the world, whenever you need it. And that does involve confronting some of the trade-offs that involve domestic conversations about what you are willing to concede in order to start to bed in those relationships. Because as we've heard, having a trade agreement isn't enough, but it is often a good first step towards locking in those relationships and making you more resilient as you go forward. But to move to just sort of a final point and focus on somewhere where I think Labour could really have a positive agenda, it's in the trade and climate space. We've seen the Labour government in New Zealand be incredibly proactive on this with the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, plurilateral, that the UK I think is still technically considering joining, but certainly could. But it also, under the same Labour government, initiated the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a modular agreement looking at sort of cooperations in different bits of the digital space. But within that environmental agenda, I always find it useful to break it down slightly, because people say trade and environment and they mean different things, because it can mean using trade to further environmental objectives. So this could be removing tariffs on environmental goods. So on the imported wind turbines, this is something that the current government has actually done quite well with. There's then environmental policies that have an impact on trade. So this is when you get into discussions about, say, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where you're not necessarily, the purpose of the tool isn't necessarily to disrupt change or alter trade flows, but that would be an inevitable consequence. But it could also be regulation to phase out biofuels or the like. It has implications more broadly. You then have trade as leverage to further environmental objectives. So this is where, for example, you agree a trade agreement, but you put some conditionality in on, say, compliance with your Paris obligations or the like. So there's conditionality in there. There's then trade as a driver of climate change, and this is something that does need to be addressed in terms of the emissions of shipping and the like, so there's a role there. But then the fifth one, and this brings me back to my resilience point, and I feel it is the one that's underappreciated, it's the trade impacts of climate change itself. In the UK, we sometimes feel we're sort of divorced from all of these impacts. They happen far away, but actually things that happen far away often do impact us as well. And actually thinking about how to make the country resilient in the face of a world that is going to change quite significantly is incredibly important, and something that I do think Labour could develop some thinking on.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think lots of interesting topics we've touched on there. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes and put questions back to the panel. But while I do that, please do think of your own questions, and I will come to you shortly. Get ready to come forward with some questions. One of the things that I wanted to pick up, which Sally mentioned, which I think is an interesting point, you said that the future government should sort of make some big bets in terms of looking at our key export sectors and where we're strong, and sort of, I guess the question there is how much is that in tension with this, I think, aspiration that both parties have had to look at kind of spreading growth around the country, making more of Britain global as opposed to just promoting global Britain, if you get my drift, sort of spreading that sort of the level of exporters across the country. Do you see those things as being in tension, or do you think that they are, that you can sort of pick sort of double down on specialisation and still achieve that?
So before I answer that question, I would just like to point out that Sam has written the most outstanding paper on green trade policy. And he's much too modest to tell you, but if you look it up, it is really, really worth reading, Nick, because it's really brilliant.
Absolutely, and just to add, you should follow Sam on Twitter, as I do.
But now we've moved on from the Lowe love-in. To answer your specific question, I think you can do both. I think you can pick the sectors or subsectors where the best export potential lies, and also analyse them in the context of, for example, which part of the country most specialises in those, and use those two pieces of information together to ensure that you've got a fair distribution of where the money is going. So you might pick, for example, automotive and electric vehicle in the Midlands. You might pick the absolutely brilliant work that Welsh semiconductor design businesses are doing. So that's not exporting semiconductors, it's exporting the IP associated with semiconductors. You might be looking at the amazing work that's being done with green tech in the northeast. You know, all of those are places where I would put my bets, all of which are, I think, going to be enormously important globally going forward, none of which are in London and the southeast. So I think you can manage both, but you have to do it thoughtfully, and you then have to give time for those bets to actually deliver some return. You can't just keep chopping and changing and saying, well, it's green tech this month, but in 6 months' time we're going to swap to something else. That's not the way that's going to work. It needs to be given time to work through.
Okay, thank you very much. I've already seen some hands come up, so I think let's go back to the room and put as many questions as we can. The gentleman at the back, I think, raised his hand first.
Thank you.
If you just say your name and if you're affiliated with any organisation, that would be fine.
Sure, I'm Nick Palmer. I used to be MP for Broxtowe. I'm now head of Compassion in World Farming. The question I want to ask was, we very much welcome what you said, Nick, about having quality trade deals and not a race to the bottom. Quite specifically, one of the things we've seen going wrong in the current government is that DEFRA and Department of International Trade speak with different voices. So we actually have trade deals where production that would be illegal in Britain is given a zero tariff. And I wanted to ask you specifically, would you make sure that that doesn't happen under Labour? Because what that does is simply export production methods that we feel are unacceptable within Britain. And when I say we, I mean the government.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead and answer that?
Yeah. I mean, Nick, great to see you at conference, by the way. And just to pick up on that, I think that on the two issues, firstly, there is most definitely an issue between DEFRA and DIT. They don't appear to speak to each other, as far as I can make out, which clearly has to change. And secondly, I mean, I'm in favour of free trade with Australia, okay? Free trade with New Zealand, absolutely. And New Zealand, by the way, has got a very good gender chapter that I think is a real model for a lot of other deals. So I'm very much in favour of those. And the truth is, they're done now, they're signed and they're gone. However, I firmly believe that the Australia deal was closed out extremely quickly just so that the UK government could get the fact of the deal, is what I think happened. You know, I've made the point previously that in early December, Alok Sharma it's in Hansard, made a statement in Parliament to say that there would be an explicit mention in the Australia trade deal of the rise in global temperatures being limited to 1.5 degrees. 16 days later, when the trade deal appeared, there was no sign of it. And that immediately suggests to me that concessions were made on the UK side, that, frankly, they did just to get the deal over the line, to sort of present that they had a first deal. My approach is much more in the line, as has been quoted, of the inch-by-inch negotiations and driving a hard bargain. I think that's exactly what is in the UK's interest and what I would propose to do.
Okay. The gentleman in the third row here, please.
Thank you very much. Anton Spisak, Tony Blair Institute. One thing that was not discussed by the panel, and I would like to get your views on this, is services. And specifically, if we kind of, zoom out, I think the nature of globalization is really starting to change now. Goods trade has really peaked globally, but actually what we are seeing is the real rise in intermediate services around the globe. And this is one of the things that the UK is really good at. It is really good at exporting intermediate services, business services, IT, intellectual property rights, design, things like that. So there's a real opportunity for the UK, and I think for the Labour government, to set out a really ambitious agenda around supporting services trade. But I think there's also a real risk, actually, that other countries, as globalization is really changing, will gain a real kind of competitive advantage in the aspects of services now. So I think there needs to be a real push to try to look at this question strategically. And I would just love to get your thoughts, Nick, on this.
Right, so I might take one other question. The gentleman next to you is also...
Thanks a lot. David Bell from the British Standards Institution and self-confessed follower of Sam on Twitter. Just to add to Sally's list of unsexy and unglamorous topics, just to add standards to that mix, we know that SMEs and other companies export more if they use international standards, and if we can influence those standards, it absolutely turbocharges British industry. I read with interest the industrial strategy document, I think which is a great step forward, where these strategies have worked really well in other countries. For example, the German Industry 4.0 strategy, they put standards at the heart, and I wonder whether Labour might consider that to give a more structural role, because if the UK systematically gets behind influencing global standards, we can absolutely turbocharge those key industries for the future.
Okay, thank you. Inevitably, all the questions are going to direct to Nick. I will bring the other panellists in a bit as well. So, Sam and Sally, I don't know if anything on the services point.
Could I come in on Anton's? Because I think you can actually expand it further, because I think you're right about intermediary services. But also, if you take a step sort of back and look forward, as well. You don't have to sort of be the biggest believer in virtual reality taking over to accept that more and more economic activity is moving online and into the virtual space. You can see that driven by the pandemic and working patterns there. And this will deliver quite a lot of challenges for policymakers. We're already seeing it in taxation. If people start to work remotely abroad, what do you do about social security? But you can also then start to see it in terms of licensing. There's a question of what happens if the immigration regime of the real world gets pulled into the virtual space. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if I want to, say I was a very famous musician, which I'm not, but say I wanted to play a gig in Croatia, I'd need to get a permit and a license to do that, but I could do the same thing on Fortnite for all of the Croatian citizens without there being an issue. This is a bit of an absurd example, but what if there became a point where the political drivers that drive Croatia to have this restriction on foreign musicians move into the virtual space? You can see this for business consultants and the like as well, whereby
and
me
ABBA.
delivering...
ABBA. They're not real, are they?
Right.
Who's seen ABBA?
I think they were once, hopefully. But I'm sort of using slightly absurd examples, but I do think there's a real point here, which is that regulation as it exists in the real world is there for a reason. You might disagree with it or not, and it was driven by domestic political concerns usually. That will seep over into the virtual space, and at the moment, commerce is quite free in that space, and it will become restricted, or will it? And that's something that I think government really needs to start to think about and wrestle with.
Thank you. I think Sally had something to add on the services point.
Yeah, just to say, I don't think we can have a proper conversation about services until we change the conversation. And the reality is that goods companies, Diageo being a great example, are brilliant at saying things like, if we reduce tariffs, we would sell an extra 100,000 units of scotch in India. And everyone goes, oh, 100,000 units of scotch, that sounds like a lot of scotch. Great. Brilliant for the exchequer, brilliant for jobs. We in services haven't got that same proper explanation of what we do. So we talk about things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or conformity assessments for standards, and everyone goes, oh my God, and falls asleep, and it's just awful. What we need to be doing is saying, all right, we're not talking about 100,000 units of scotch. We're talking about the office building in Malaysia that's designed by British architects, where the contracts have been drawn up by British lawyers, where the engineering design has come from one of the great British engineering companies, where EY has done all of the ESG reporting to show that it is genuinely carbon neutral, and Nick goes and does the ribbon opening ceremony to get his photo opportunity. That we have a proper that is when we have a proper conversation about services. But until nerds like us manage to move the conversation around to the output rather than the lever that changes the output, we're not going to get anyone interested in us, and everyone will be falling asleep in rooms as they already are. So that's my thing on services, is that we are brilliant at it, and there are some really big bets, again, that we can place on it. But let's get people excited about it first so that they get behind what it is that we're trying to do.
Can I just come in on that as well? I think it's so important. As someone who's relatively new to international trade as well, I've only been doing it for a couple of years, but I think the language that's used is often confusing and kind of puts people off even starting the conversation. And actually, the more you focus on, you know, what are the benefits to the UK, to others, it makes it really concrete and clear for people. And I think that is one of the challenges that people see when they think about international trade, is something that's up there. The more you bring it down to the local and the understandable, the easier it is to kind of comprehend.
Nick,
I think Sally did a very good job of selling our services sector then, actually. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's how, I think, people generally speak about exports, and I think people do generally think of a good, and whether it's a fine Diageo product or indeed many others. But actually, the conformity assessment for standards and the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, etc., are all really, really important. And they're important, firstly, because if you look at our exports, of course, it's hugely services. It's services, whether it's, you know, my old profession, legal services, whether it's accountancy services, intermediate services that were being mentioned, I think Anton mentioned in the question. These are things in which Britain can be a world leader, and I totally agree. We are in danger on this of being left behind when there are huge opportunities. You know, whether it's the legal qualifications, the accountancy qualifications are still world leading. We very much have that as a huge asset for us around the world, but we have to be willing to go out to sell it. We've got to be willing as well to have, you know, all our diplomatic teams around the world really focused in. I mean, I've been out to the embassy in Paris and other places, and I know that is exactly what our fine diplomats are doing, adjusting to our new trading arrangements, but we've really got to power that forward. And then in terms of being leaders in international standards, absolutely, because it is not in our interest to take part in a race to the bottom. I am not in favour of some sort of mass deregulation going on to try to undercut the EU on, workers' standards or product standards or things like that. I think that race to the bottom is a damage to the UK and indeed more widely as well. So I think being in the arena internationally, shaping those international high standards, it isn't just, for me, the right thing to do, it's what's in our interest to do.
Okay, thank you. And the lady in the second row here, please.
Hi, Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald. My question is to you, Nick. What kind of are your KPIs for a first term? We've got 3 big targets, the US, India, maybe even China. What countries are you going to be pursuing a free trade deal with? And broadly, what do you want to get out of them? I mean, are we talking immigration, more favourable conditions for immigration? Are you talking mainly trade, or is it really services where you're going to get bang for buck? And also, are you confident of even striking a deal with the United States, noting that the Biden administration seems to be very cool on this idea?
Do you want me to directly answer that, or do you want to take some more?
Go for that one, yeah. I think then we'll pick some more.
Okay, well, firstly, it wouldn't be my intention to start breaking off talks that I inherit. I mean, it may be the case that some talks are completed and I've got a completed deal to get to it. The next general election could be as late as January 2025, so I'll have to inherit what I've got at that stage. Clearly, in terms of free trade with the United States, obviously the Northern Ireland Protocol issue is a roadblock. There is a wider, I think our approach on that, by the way, would be very, very different from the current government's. Clearly, there is an issue as to whether both countries would want to enter into an FTA, but if that were an opportunity, yes, then I would be looking to do that. Of course, there are other countries we'd be very interested in. Canada, for example, if that hasn't been completed, we're very interested in as well. I'll tell you, and I don't want to anticipate the speech I'm giving in the hall later on the key performance indicators, but one of the things that we will really be pushing is for trade to benefit all parts of the United Kingdom, and that is a real issue for us. If you look at the statistics of where exporters actually are, I'm afraid there are some regions where the statistic is very, very small indeed. So for me, it will be about the work that I can do to try to make sure that the deepening trading relations that we have are actually benefiting communities around the country. That doesn't mean in any sense, London and the South East are hugely successful. I don't want to make them unsuccessful. What I want to do is to also spread the benefits around the rest of the country. So that's the test that I'll judge myself by.
And on that point, Nick, I think it's something that you mentioned, Shevaun, as well, in terms of what government can practically do. Once you have a deal in place, what can government practically do alongside organisations like yours to actually help people export, or people who export to one market to grow their presence in other markets? What are the kind of things that you're looking to government to do in order to do that, facilitate that?
I mean, Sally touched on it as well. It's so complicated as an exporter to work out how to do it, where to do it, and now, of course, with the different paperwork you need to fill in. I was with a group of SMEs the other day, and really successful tea business. They send the same shipment every week to Spain, and sometimes it gets there, and sometimes it doesn't, and it's the same paperwork, and you just think, they are banging their head against the brick wall. So there's a big bit around comms in terms of simplifying and explaining the FTAs and how to do it and where to do it. But there's also, when you're running a small, medium-sized business, you have a really long list of things that you're worrying about. And at the moment, you have a really, really long list. So actually, someone like the Chamber Network or, advisors to come in to help you look at your business and work out what you're doing now, but actually where might be the upside into new markets would be hugely valuable. And actually, Nick's point to, spreading the love around the country, at the back of the room is Richard Burge, who's the CEO of our London Chamber. And, trade is huge for us across the country, and we don't, we're constantly saying to government, they just took so much money out of London and the South East. That's not the right thing to do. We're leveled down bits of the country. We want to promote it across the board.
Okay, thank you. The two gentlemen in the front row, I think we'll ask both of these, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the trade remedies regime. The current government set up a trade remedies regime that this is for those of you not familiar with it, to deal with action in response to foreign subsidies and action in response to foreign dumping of products on the UK market. The current government set up a trade remedies regime. It had an immediate set of challenges in what to do about existing EU trade remedies and whether to carry them over. It's also faced another challenge from government because a particular balance had been set by the government as to what decisions were for the Trade Remedies Authority and what decisions would be left by ministers. And the first time anything actually happened, the government decided to shift the balance. So my question is, I mean, obviously addressed at Nick, but also to other members of the panel, and Diageo has a particular interest in trade remedies because Scotch whisky tends to be the one that gets into the firing line when things go wrong. But what would Nick and what would the panel suggest about doing about that regime over the term of the Labour government?
Thank you. I'm Anthony Manchester from BlackRock. I'm also one of Sam's fans. I've been reading your stuff since Brexit. But I mean, I'd be interested in Sam's views and Nick's views in particular, because I'd like to know a bit more, Nick, about what, if you could put some flesh on the bones, please, of what improving the TCA, the agreement with the EU, actually will mean in practice, and what scope there is, Sam, to do that. Because certainly the narrative at the time of the agreement was that a more intensive trading relationship was only possible by following EU rules and adhering to them. And Nick, you talk about negotiating a veterinary agreement. I mean, but to what extent is it possible to have a negotiation? Is it basically following the EU's phytosanitary and veterinary standards or not? So just be interested to see what that means in practice and how that could potentially look, given the narrative that I don't know whether you call them current government or not, but current party in power put on it at the time.
Okay, thank you. So I might come to Sam first on that. I think the question about the TCA, the UK-EU agreement, is really interesting. I think because you mentioned Keir Starmer's speech, which basically said we're not going to rejoin the single market, we're not going to be part of a customs union. So what are the practical things that you can do within that sort of remit? And I think also to answer the question there, is it just a question of being a rule taker, therefore?
So taking into account the self-imposed constraints, which you can argue as to the justification, so no customs union, no single market, what you're looking at, I would argue, are tweaks that could create significant improvements for certain industries, but certainly wouldn't, resulting across the board reintegration. So to take some examples with the veterinary agreement, first thing we have to do is say that veterinary agreements live on a scale. So David Frost would constantly say that he was actually trying to do a veterinary agreement. He wanted something similar to what the EU has with New Zealand, which results in a reduction in paperwork, a reduction in checks, but doesn't remove all of the obligations. Whereas I think what Labour is discussing, although I might get corrected, is something more akin to what Switzerland has, which is a deep integrated veterinary relationship, which removes all need for additional export health certificates, additional inspections, would greatly help the situation in Northern Ireland vis-à-vis Great Britain to Northern Ireland trade in agri-food products, and also help trade in food from Great Britain to the rest of the EU. But the trade-off there is it would require, at least in my view, the UK binding itself to EU sanitary and phytosanitary rules, so food hygiene rules, both as applied domestically and in relation to imports from elsewhere, which then brings the follow-up question, well, what does this mean for our independent trade policy, given the nature of the discussion we're having now? And the answer again is it's complicated. My view is it wouldn't have made a difference for the New Zealand and Australia agreements, because neither of those agreements require the UK to change any of its SPS rules. It clearly would pose some problems with the US, but a lot of that does depend on which government is in place, Democratic or Republican, and how much they care about Northern Ireland, because the US has already indicated previously some flexibility if an SPS relationship would help vis-a-vis Northern Ireland. It would complicate things for CPTPP accession. CPTPP accession is already, my view is it will happen, but it's not the case that the UK is automatically compliant with all of the different rules. There's some issues on patents and there's some other areas of divergence, including on conformity assessment, which I know BSI are interested in, which brings me to my third point in terms of where you could get reintegration, mutual recognition of conformity assessment to allow for third-party notification bodies in the UK to certify products to EU standards. Sorry, a mouthful. The reason that didn't happen wasn't because the UK didn't ask for it, it's because the EU said no. So that's the barrier that you have to overcome. The EU does have that relationship with other countries such as the US, New Zealand, Australia. The other one is mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which Sally could definitely develop. The issue there is not that it can't be done, and I think it is something Labour should pursue. It's something the EU finds very difficult to do externally, because its own internal system of professional qualifications and the recognition is convoluted and contested. But there are things Labour could do without, I think, breaching its commitments on single market and customs union, although some of them, like veterinary agreement, if they are to work as envisioned, do require discussion of trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that discussion of trade-offs. So if I just deal with the two questions. Firstly, to George on the Trade Remedies Authority, we will certainly look at the Trade Remedies Authority regime. One thing that I think emerged during the debates on steel, which is where this regime started to be used by the government, was that they are not at the moment tasked with taking into account economic harm in particular areas. And of course the issue on steel, although there are of course significant supply chains that exist and so on, there are particular communities across the UK that if they were to lose their steel industry would be devastated, frankly. So we are going to look at the instructions that the Trade Remedies Authority has, and that's something I'll be looking to do at quite an early stage. I think Sam summed up a lot of the issues around the SPS agreement there actually, but for me, I take, firstly, a very practical approach. I listen to what is said to me by the Port of Dover about what practically is happening to them in terms of the checks that already exist and the further checks that come down the line, that some of which have been delayed by the government, some of which, frankly, they've never done or made any effort to actually prepare for. So it will be a pragmatic sense of trying to reduce as far as we possibly can the checks that are necessary. Now, the veterinary agreement, which of course then that raises other issues we have to solve in other areas, but in respect of the United States has been very clear that it wants to see a resolution to the Northern Ireland issue, and I think that an SPS agreement would take away the need for a significant number of the checks that are required on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think we also need to do something around real-time data sharing with the protocol as well. And if you get those kinds of things in place, you end up with a situation on the Northern Ireland Protocol where you're left with a list of products. It's a question then of getting people into a room and trying to come to an agreement on those. You know, we've discussed, I think, the mutual recognition of professional qualifications as well. But for me, it is about political will. And frankly, I don't detect a great deal of positive political will from this government, unfortunately, towards the European Union. I worry that they're going to reach back into the past when they've had this very, very adversarial relationship, whereas I actually believe that most issues can be solved within the constraints, the political constraints we've set out, with some political will and the ability to get around the table.
Okay, thank you. I know, Nick, you've got to shoot off in a few minutes, but I'm going to take two very quick, they can be very quick questions, that would be great. The gentleman in the fourth row here, and then the gentleman just in front of him in the blue shirt, please.
Hi, my name's Emilio. I'm a reporter for Politico. Question for Nick. So you're announcing today, as you mentioned, that under Labour government, negotiators will be mandated to ensure deals boost industries in every region. Lots of trade economists argue that some of the biggest gains in trade deals come not from increased exports, but from the incoming competition from overseas. forcing domestic industries to modernise and become more efficient. So, for example, one of Sam's more absurd examples would be steel producers, say in South Wales, might go bust, but the workers might become software developers or something, which might benefit the economy in the long term. Does your region's policy accept and account for that, or is there a risk of propping up industries almost at the expense of the bigger development gains? And secondly, just because you mentioned about you would keep all running negotiations, you would carry on with them, the ones that you inherit, does that include the Gulf Cooperation Council, which obviously has a few human rights abusing nations?
On your first question, I mean, steel is an exception as a foundational industry, but also one of the issues with steel, there's a worldwide issue where steel is being produced and put onto the market at lower than production cost. But I think what you're generally describing there is some of the trade-offs within all international trade. But of course, what I will have to do, and by the way, don't give away too much of my speech, Emilio, for this afternoon. What I'll be setting out this afternoon is what I will be tasking negotiators to do at the stage that they have a mandate, at the stage when they are in the room, is to have regard to all these issues. What is the impact on different regions of the UK? And it isn't, just to answer the point, absolutely not about taking away the success of London and the South East. It's about the rest of the country having those opportunities. But I don't think steel is, in answer to your question, Amelia, the best example to use because of the particular circumstances. And in terms of the Gulf Cooperation Council, we've already got significant trade with the Gulf states. And the way that I see it is, do I want to not engage with those states and put those concerns on the table? Absolutely not. What I want to do is engage. Whenever I engage, I always raise the particular concerns that they are. And I think that approach of trade, but also making very, very clear the concerns that we have around particular human rights is the correct way to proceed on that.
Okay, thank you. Have you got time for one more?
Yes, go on.
Okay, the gentleman here in the blue shirt who I mentioned earlier. Thank you. That's no problem.
Hi, Nick. It's Jonathan Brent from Pernod Ricard. Following on from that question, could the panel say a little bit about trade and navigating geopolitics? How should Labour approach China? And also, given the geopolitical tensions, where are the best places to target to diversify our trade? Because I'm like Aileen in the spirit sector, and we see huge opportunities in markets like Brazil or Nigeria, but that is definitely the hard graft of negotiation and market access work.
Yeah. I can't really do that question justice in 60 seconds. Look, clearly it's about David Lammy and I working very, very closely together. I mean, specifically in relation to China, I think it's fair to say the UK government has gone through some various iterations of policy on China over the past 12 years. But it is about that balance with China between security and economics. China exists, it's a huge economic powerhouse, but we do have deep concerns around whether it's Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, the abuses against the Uyghurs, but also we have perfectly reasonable security concerns. I don't just mean in a military sense, important though that is, also in terms of intellectual property and Chinese activity here in the agent activity in the United Kingdom. So there are difficult balances and difficult things to be struck on China in terms of the economics versus the security, which are the difficult things we're going to have to do. More widely, we have to link our foreign policy with our trade policy, and we've seen what's happened. You know, I was one of the first to get out there to be calling for the sanctions on Russia after the appalling invasion of Ukraine. I was one of the first to be arguing for a luxury goods ban. I got myself banned from Russia for my trouble for all this. But nonetheless, that is an indication. Take Russia, for example. Countries that are overrunning other countries in that way, clearly it's going to affect our trade policy. But where there are parts of the world where we genuinely believe that our engagement and our trade can be a force for good, I'm in favour of doing it and engaging.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have to leave, unfortunately.
I do. I wish I could have continued with that, because it was an excellent question. But yes, thank you very much.
So, well, thank you, Nick. I think everyone could have thanked Nick. But yeah, I mean, if anyone else wants to come in on that, because it's obviously a very meaty question. Anyone else like to come in on that question on the geopolitical aspects? And I think it touches on the point about resilience that you were making earlier, Sam.
I think so. Geopolitically, if we're just looking at the agreements that are on the table, I think the answer that jumps out is India. insofar as this is an agreement that would be significant both in terms of commerce but also in terms of deepening the relationship between not only India, but if you consider that you've got the EU pursuing its Trade and Technology Council with India as well, reopening the discussions there, a country that is incredibly significant if you're thinking of the world as people who talk about geopolitics do in terms of sort of spheres of influence. I mean, you've also then got to discuss the Gulf. Right, I mean, it's a tricky one for many reasons, but if you are living in this geopolitical world, that comes front and centre. And I suppose the challenge there is aligning government policy so that you are delivering both the geopolitical ambitions and the commercial ambitions. Because if you go too far in either direction, you might get less than what you could. And I think that's particularly true now. What with the sort of artificial deadline for the India FTA, which if all goes well, could be very, very good, but there's also a risk that things get left out or pushed to the side or left till later when they shouldn't be.
Aileen, when I come to you on that one, as sort of from a business point of view, to what extent does that sort of, I think, in an increasingly sort of fraught world, that fusing of politics and trade, which has always been there, but I think it's probably coming more to what extent does that worry you as a business?
Yeah, it's something we monitor really closely. I mean, a few people have mentioned, the conflict in Russia and Ukraine being one, the impact that has on energy costs, on supply chain, on the barley that we use to make our products. I think there's a constant watching eye. I do think one of the points that I tried to make in my opener was about not trying to look at these things in isolation. I think there's a potential for trade and the kind of geopolitics of the world to come together and try and use that as a kind of force for good. So opening communities, understanding their priorities and trying to kind of identify. I mean, I think India is a good example where there's a win-win situation, certainly on Scotch, which is what obviously is the kind of bread and butter of what our company does. But I think trying to look at it not just through the narrow lens of trade, but looking at it through what are the countries that we want to work with, but actually not just the ones that are naturally our allies, but the ones that we can work with to look at the kind of whole scale of what has been delivered and what the opportunity is there as well.
Okay, well, in the interests of ending on time, I was going to ask Sally or Shevaun if you had any sort of final comments to add either on that question or anything else that you would like to say.
I think there's always going to be a tension between the countries that business is most interested in trading with and the countries that the government needs to have a relationship with for geopolitical reasons. And sometimes those things mesh very nicely and sometimes they don't. And so one can think about the fact that arguably, geopolitically, the world is dividing down into two camps. You've got China on the one hand, and you've got what you might call the liberal democracies on the other hand. And you might put America in the centre of the liberal democracies from a geopolitical standpoint. And then you've got a whole bunch of swing states in the middle who don't really naturally fall geopolitically into either camp and will make decisions on a situation-by-situation basis for what's in their best interest. So if you're looking at trade as a geopolitical tool, you prioritise reaching trade deals with those swing states. India is one, the Gulf countries are another block. You might be looking at the South American states. And you might say, well, I'm going to stitch a relationship together in a legally binding international agreement to give them more skin in my game than in somebody else's game. But as Sam has rightly said, that gives you tensions because bad things happen in some of those countries that you don't necessarily want to align with, and that creates its own tensions. You might therefore say, well, actually what I want to do is to get a deal with the US because that stitches us into the US liberal democracies coalition even stronger. Actually, the weird thing is that when I speak to companies, none of them are clamouring for a US trade deal particularly. And I think the reason for that is that on the whole, you can do the stuff you want to do with the US because both the US and UK are pretty open countries when it comes to trade. And the stuff that you can't do is ridiculously difficult to unlock through a free trade agreement, either because it's massively politically sensitive, like NHS procurement in the UK, or because it's governed on a state level basis in the US, which means that a federal level agreement doesn't unlock it anyhow. So where that leaves you is you probably don't want to do a US trade deal that much because you're putting an awful lot of effort into something that doesn't deliver much benefit. It might make more sense to focus on those trickier economies that will hold the balance of power in geopolitical environments in the future. But
And
you
of
have
course,
some
trade deals aren't the only methods by which you might work with the US, say in international forums or say at the state level. Or
but it's really nuanced, and to try and look at it in black and white terms makes it really difficult to understand what those nuances are and decide what trade-offs you're going to make.
Okay.
Can I just come in? So it's just your point about, it's really interesting that in this discussion and in any discussion about international trade, you inevitably talk about free trade agreements. But I think your point about, you know, some of the things, like number one, we've talked about tariffs getting in the way of what we do as a business, but actually once you dive down after that, it's very quickly about regulations, and they are state level regulations. There's things that favour, you know, local beer and wine producers over imported spirits producers. And so actually it's trying to get that balance out of not just being focused on free trade agreements, but actually looking at the other mechanisms and levers that can be used as well. And inevitably we fall to talk about free trade agreements, but there's so much more that can happen underneath to kind of alleviate and make the trade easier for businesses. That doesn't take as long as a free trade agreement.
I think I covered that on my point, but I just would say that the ICC, the International Chambers of Commerce, was set up post-war to help sustain and grow global world peace. And trade has to be seen, I think, as a force for good. We've talked about climate, we've talked about gender, we've talked about keeping those conversations open, because only once those conversations stay open can you solve problems. So let's use trade for that.
Okay, on that positive note, thank you very much. Could you please thank the panel in the normal way?